Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of Sunday Night Live, your favorite automotive show where we talk about the issues that affect the customer experience at your store. Whether it's the front of the store, the back of the store, the middle, doesn't really matter because the greater the experience, the more they come back to you for everything they need when they need it. And we've certainly had a bunch of crazy stuff in the news lately with the CDK ransomware attack that's kind of brought cybersecurity to the forefront of everybody's life. But I want to tell you, it's nothing new. About 20 years ago, I was selling cars over the internet, and I was shipping cars across the country and overseas. And what I used to find, I'd get these emails where I'd get an email from supposedly PayPal telling me that I just got wired like $40,000 or something like that, and click here to confirm your wire transfer. Well, I was a little bit on the cautious side way back when, so I never clicked on the link. But what I did is I opened another browser and I went on the PayPal and I checked to see whether or not such a wire transfer came through, and lo and behold, it didn't. So that was my early introduction to cyber crime and phishing attacks and things like that. But it's certainly gotten a lot worse. I figured, you know what? It's relevant and timely to bring my buddy, Robert Siciliano, on to talk about cybersecurity because this is in his wheelhouse. This is what he does all the time. But before he introduces himself, I want to play this little clip because I think this is really cool. Here we go.
Joining me now, Robert Siciliano, CEO of IT
Security expert Robert Siciliano says your ATM
security consultant with the info to help you burn the bad guys.
I'm Robert Siciliano, and I'm a personal security expert.
Hey, buddy.
He's certainly not. What happened? Okay. So he's no newcomer to the cybersecurity world. So Robert, welcome and introduce yourself, my friend.
So I am in Boston, Massachusetts. And for those of you who know Boston and know this accent, I have never, ever parked a car in Harvard Yard ever. Just so you know. And yeah, I've been in the business of essentially cybersecurity awareness training for decades. You know, I go into organizations and get them up to speed in regards to all things cyber, social, identity, and even personal protection. Automotive, manufacturing, construction, real estate, you name it. Everybody that touches a digital device, everybody that essentially has a social security number, any organization that has a bank account, and that's pretty much everyone, there's risk. And that risk is managed generally by your CIO, CTO, CISO, or if you're a do-it-yourselfer, if you're a small mom and pop, then you might utilize what's called a managed service provider or a managed security service provider, or you're really a true do-it-yourselfer and you have, just antivirus and a password manager, if that, and don't really have much in the way of layers of protection to keep your network secure. So I go into organizations or at their conferences and say, hey, these are all the fundamentals. This is what you're supposed to be doing. These are all the resources available to you. And you can take advantage of them or not, and kind of disseminate the world of cybersecurity revolving around digital literacy and, give people options and give people something to think about and solid strategies to reduce risk. Yeah.
And there's certainly a lot of risk today. Hey, Mark Grodicke, have not seen you in a long time, my friend. This is high-fall, interesting topic for the times. Met him on Auto Transport Intel, the trucking show, where I learned a bunch of stuff about the trucking industry and as how it relates to automotive. So ransomware is huge. Before they were just after stealing your passwords, getting into your accounts, taking your money, and calling it a day. But let's define ransomware.
Sure. So ransomware is essentially a compromise, a vulnerability on your devices, on your network. It could be a single computer or a network of devices, a mainframe of sorts, that when the software is compromised, it's compromised in such a way where it's essentially unusable in so many ways. It could be the data itself has been locked down and encrypted by the criminals, and or the whole network or a portion of the network is locked down, encrypted, out of reach of that organization in such a way where it cripples that organization's ability to function in certain ways. So, for example, Colonial Pipeline is a part of our critical infrastructure, really. I mean, it's arguably, they had a part of their network compromised back in, I think it might have been 2022. And they supply, gasoline, fuel to over 1,000 gas stations from New York along the eastern seaboard down over to Houston. And a part of the network was compromised in such a way where they were unable to bill, to invoice their clients. And so as a result, over the course of a week, over 1,000 gas stations ran out of gas, because that part of their network was locked down by the criminals. And they were extorted for $5 million, just about $5 million in ransom. Change Healthcare, just this year. Change Healthcare, which is a massive organization. I think they work with over 1,000 different pharmacies across the U.S. They ended up getting ransomware in their devices, compromised their ability to write scripts or communicate with various vendors and such. And they ended up, I think, paying about $22 million in ransom. Clorox, the disinfectant, the bleach. Part of their operations was shut down back in, I think, the summer of 2023. They were unable to manufacture product for close to a month. And remember MGM casinos in Vegas?
Yeah.
They were shut down for over a week, I believe. Elevators stopped working. The slot machines stopped working. TVs were out. They were essentially shut. People's key cards to their hotel rooms didn't work. So when you think about how much you and I rely on technology, like think about your mobile phone and how much you rely on your mobile phone. Think of how disadvantaged you'd be if your phone was lost or stolen just for a day. Think of that and how compromised you'd be. And then think of, like, if you're on a business trip and you lost your phone, right? No email, no phone calls, no text message, nothing. Maybe even like you wouldn't even, maybe if you had your itinerary on your phone, you wouldn't even know where you were going. You wouldn't, if you got off the plane, you wouldn't even know what hotel you were staying at, in some cases, right? You wouldn't even be able to get an Uber, right? Like you'd be screwed.
My rental car, everything, gone.
Think about that in regards to like an entire operation. Like CDK is a software as a service provider whose platform is used by car dealerships to run all aspects of various car dealerships operations, like sales, financing, inventory, service, back office functions.
Everything.
And their software is compromised, and then the platform shut down. Car dealerships had to switch to pen and paper to conduct their operations.
That's where I started, Robert. Paper, pen and paper.
All of us, yeah. And that ransomware as a service is a scam that is extremely lucrative, extremely lucrative. It shuts down the operation for periods of time, and the criminals say, listen, just pay us and we'll give you back full operation of everything. And a lot of organizations that are unprepared do that. Yeah. It's a
Now,
nightmare.
doesn't the FBI tell people just pay because we can't get it?
No. The FBI would suggest that you don't. So government officials would suggest that you don't. Because here's the deal. Generally, if and when you are afflicted with ransomware, there's a good chance that that organization is funding terrorist operations. Like the North Koreans are great at ransomware. The Russians are great at ransomware. Chinese are great at ransomware, you know? And so when you have nation states behind locking down a network and holding it for ransom, that money is not going to, you know, Kim Jong-un's, you know, Mercedes. It's going to like nuclear warheads. And that's a problem. And so paying the ransom is the last resort, really. Like you should have backup of everything in such a way where you should be able to flip a switch in some way, shape, or form and get back online in a relatively short period of time, depending on the size and scope of the breach. And it's not to say that like CDK did something wrong. They're a victim of a crime here, you know? Right. And so, you know, blaming the victim is never a smart thing to do. When it comes to data security, when it comes to data breaches, when it comes to ransomware, back in the early 2000s, when data breaches occurred at a regular basis, and they're certainly multiplying on a regular basis now too. But back then, you know, the lengths that those who are breached would go to kind of cover things up, to not talk about it, to kind of sweep it under the rug and not disclose the breach to those who were affected. The bad behavior revolving around corporations back in the day, early 2000s, led to finger pointing by consumers, by the media, to these irresponsible organizations that were victims of crime, but at the same time, they covered things up and they really weren't making the necessary investments into their networks to protect them in the first place. So there was like so many things that were wrong back then in regards to responding to data breaches or preventing them in the first place, that pointing the finger made sense in a number of ways. But today, most organizations, including CDK and others, you know, think about MGM. Like these organizations, they spend millions of dollars to make sure that their data, our information, you know, is safe and secure. But still, you know, they are victims of crime. And it's likely that they did most things right. But still, it's like they have today what's called a large attack surface. And that attack surface is like, you know, you think of like your kitchen table. Well, yeah. where your plate is may be an attack surface. But now you have like 10 people over for dinner. Every plate is now a larger attack surface. You know, so you know CDK as a massive company with, you know, clients everywhere. That breach could have occurred from a number of different places. And, you know, you could only plug the dike so effectively until, you know, it just breaches.
Now, let me ask you a question. So I back up all my data, but everything's cloud-based today, no?
Well, yeah, but everything is cloud-based. Like, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like your bank is cloud-based. Right, where you bank is cloud-based. You know, where you get your Netflix is cloud-based. Where you know conduct peer-to-peer payment transactions via Venmo and PayPal and Cash App, that's all cloud-based. You know, StreamYard is cloud-based. Zoom is cloud-based. Like everything is cloud-based. It's all the cloud. But what the cloud is, so people aren't. So when we use the word the cloud, we think. We default to fluffy white things in the sky that have little or no security. And that's really not what the cloud actually is. It just kind of like and I know that that's not what you just did there, but that's kind of what we do in a way. We don't really give it much credit in regards to its security. But you have to think like if Bank of America is cloud-based, but what that fundamentally means is their servers are in a climate-controlled, secure environment, generally under lock and key, under various forms of physical security, backed up in a number of different ways, and they spend millions of dollars a month on their hardware and software and the information security professionals to make sure that their cloud-based data is protected. So yeah, it's in the cloud, but it's physically stored in secure server rooms. All of it, every bit of it, every aspect of it. So the cloud really is just, hardware and secure servers all over the planet.
Now, when I worked at CDK a few years ago, I actually, one of the things that we did, we got a tour of that secure facility. I mean, the place is locked down.
Yeah.
Right? So if you back up your data, is it as simple as then loading it onto a new machine? Or as soon as you go online, everything gets shut down again?
Yeah, well, as you know, being on this planet for as long as you and I have, nothing is simple. Nothing. Nothing is simple. So just flipping that switch and restoring everything back to, make you whole, it's never as easy as just flipping a switch. Nothing is, other than actually flipping a switch. And it usually will take, a day to a week, depending on the size and scope of the organization. And if you're supplying, 15,000 dealerships across the country, it's going to take more than flipping a switch. It's going to take, a concerted effort to get everything back online from its compromised position. And depending on how deep they burrowed in that network, depending on how widespread they got, would also have an impact on their ability to get back online in a timely fashion. But, those contingency plans are there. Those backup strategies are there. And all the hardware and all the software and all the experts that are responsible for managing all of that are there. But like anything, like when we talk about herding cats, right? How difficult is it to herd cats? Difficult, because they all have their own, personalities. Yep, managing all the people that are responsible for managing all that hardware and software and getting all that, up and running, back to order, can take days, weeks, and sometimes longer. The Change Healthcare data breach, they're still dealing with that. It's been going on for a couple of months now. Just the way it is. To the degree that we rely on the technology at our fingertips, it's a massive undertaking for some operations. And the bigger they are, as they say, the harder they fall.
Now, so these big companies that you mentioned moments earlier, they all paid the ransom?
Some of them did, and some of them didn't. Not all of them paid. Some of them got it back. I think the city of Atlanta at one point, the entire city of Atlanta at one point was held to ransom. And I think they ended up, the hackers had demanded, I think it was somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 to get back online. And the city of Atlanta ended up spending like $2.2 million just to get back online without paying the hackers.
Wow.
Think about that, So in my opinion, they did the right thing by getting their network back online without paying a criminal enterprise a short amount of money, But not everybody's going to make that same decision.
Right.
But I personally would do whatever I can not to fuel the North Korean enterprise.
Now, I'm thinking that just because you pay for a de-encryption key doesn't mean that's the end of it. Right? I don't think they're just going to hand you over a key and then say, hey, have a nice day. We've done our deal and we're gone.
There's no honor among thieves, as they say. These SOBs, they're going to take their money and they're going to decide when they're going to come back at you again in the future. Because once you fork it over, but the idea is, of course, that, even if there's a data breach of sorts where data is leaked, inevitably, you're still going to need to report that to your attorneys general. You're still going to need to go through whatever process it is, whatever legal repercussions there might be. There's still going to be, repercussions. There's no question about it. It's not a matter of, oh, I pay the ransom, I can walk away. No, because the data is probably now in the hands of a criminal enterprise somewhere around the world. And those that were affected, their personal identifying information has essentially been compromised. Yeah, you can get back online, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're good. You know, you still had a breach, and that breach needs to be dealt with. And so there are data breach notification laws in place state to state. And back in 2004, only California was the only state in the nation that actually had a data breach notification law in place. Wow. And so back then, if there was a data breach, only those companies whose clients' information in some way was based in or had their client records in California, back then they would only notify the residents of California of that breach. And then when the media picked up on certain data breaches, they were like, oh, yeah, this company had 250,000 records compromised. And they alerted the people of California because they were only required to do so there. And they'd be like, but they still had people's records in 50 states compromised. People were like, hey, that's unethical corporate behavior. And so as a result of that, those companies became the poster child as to what not to do if there's a data breach. And as a result, 49 other states quickly passed data breach notification laws, and, you know, as a result. And they're pretty stringent, you know, and today, ransomware, you know, you pay the ransom, that doesn't mean you're off the hook.
The fallout from this CDK attack, if it goes through July 4th, okay, I think it's estimated to be somewhere around $1 billion. Now, I don't know how much insurance companies carry, but could it be that high a number? And even if it was that higher number, then everybody's costs go up, right?
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. Cybersecurity insurance is like every insurance. My personal opinion from my own life experience is that, and this is arguable, but my personal experience is insurance companies' job number one is not to pay the claim. Meaning that they any insurance company, I don't care what the insurance is, health, automotive, driving insurance, cybersecurity insurance, you name it, life insurance for that matter. They look at every single claim and go, okay, how can we not pay this claim? Right. So if you are someone who has life insurance and you die and they figure out later on, well, I think that they committed suicide based on the forensics. Well, your claim is not going to get paid because I don't think any life insurance company will pay for suicide. I'm pretty sure that's the case, And I think it's similar to like if you are drinking and driving and you're, driving to endanger and you get an automobile accident, you kill somebody. I'm not sure. I don't know if your automotive insurance is going to pay that claim. I just don't know. If you are negligent in so many ways, I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. I'm no expert there. You may know better than me. But when it comes to cybersecurity insurance, what I do know is that when you initially fill out the application, that you have to somewhat qualify. And that means that they may or may not do some type of forensics on your network, but they're going to ask you a number of qualifying questions in regards to the security of your network. And they may require your CIO, your CTO, your CISO, or your attorney for that matter, to work in tandem to answer all these qualifying questions in regards to the security of your network. And if you answer, yes, we are secure in regards to all these various protocols, then they're going to send you an invoice and they're going to charge you, whether it's a monthly credit card or a monthly, paper invoice or an annual invoice or whatever it might be. But if and when there's a data breach, if and when there's some type of a compromise, if and when there's a vulnerability where you make a claim, they're going to go back to your original application. They're going to go back to what made you qualify. And they're going to do some forensics on your network and go, okay, so you said that you did this and you said that you had that and so on and so forth. But what we see is like, no, you're still functioning in a Windows XP environment on Dell computers from 2013. What makes you think we would qualify or approve your claim? Like you haven't updated antivirus in 10 years for that matter. You're using hardware and software that's outdated and antiquated. You don't qualify.
You're 100% correct. I can't tell you how many stores I've gone into where we would do a network assessment and we would find appliances that are years beyond life. So in a case like that, when you have appliances like that, then that's an automatic out for the insurance company.
They call that legacy systems. And if you're like, you haven't upgraded because this software that is so simple, but it only works on Windows XP is what you've been using for all these years. It's great for what it does, but the vulnerability in regards to that device and that software allows a criminal hacker backdoor access into your network and compromises your network. Well, yeah, you save some money over the years, but now look what's happening. Now, CDK is unlikely in that type of an environment, in that situation. Their losses, you say $1 billion in losses, that's probably across their network, all their clients. I think that all of them have their own cybersecurity. They should.
Hold on a second. Let me back up on that. The dealer's loss is expected
in productivity.
to be $1 billion.
In productivity. Yeah. Yeah, right. They're going to be eating some of that. There's no getting around it. Cybersecurity insurance is not going to make them whole in that regard. They're going to make them whole to a certain point, and that's the end of it. Cybersecurity insurance is not that magic bullet, end-all, cure-all. They will cover you to a certain degree. There are limits. There are caps, like anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
Robert Allen Carvel, the CDK will have to file for bankruptcy. Class action suits being filed now. The dealer groups paid for the protection against this type of situation from CDK. Well, yes, I see reports in automotive news and various automotive publications where lawsuits are starting to happen, right? So that's going to be huge. There's just no way around that.
Yeah, it's devastating.
But it's so much more, right? Yes, there's the lawsuit. But then there's the identity theft protection that you've got to pay for. I think it's last I remember it was 2 years that you had to pay for it. There's reputational loss. But I'm glad you moments earlier you said about insurance companies trying to get out of stuff. If you're a dealer out there and you haven't done a network assessment, you might want to run that now. Because this is only the tip of the iceberg. Years ago, they were just after the data. Now they want your money and they want the data. And I think systematically it would make sense that once they have the data and your money, it's just dialing for dollars. No, I mean, you've got all this data, customer data. It seems to me good business from a bad guy standpoint to go after that.
Yeah. Getting back to insurance companies really quick, it's like right now, as we speak, because of climate change, insurance companies, that are insuring homes south of Virginia, along the eastern seaboard, around Florida, up into Houston and beyond Texas, they're just like not insuring homes any longer, right? They're just done. Like that's it. Like you're on your own. You buy your house, we're not going to insure it. Like that, you're on your own. Yeah, like they're just not insuring them. And when cybersecurity insurance is the fastest growing form of insurance there is, but they're also in the process of kind of really tightening their belt and saying, no, we're not going to insure to this point and this degree of these companies or this risk. Like they're becoming risk adverse for obvious reasons, like what we're seeing right now.
Right. Yeah, I'm a victim of identity theft, as you know. And I could not imagine on a mass scale all these other people who are potential identity theft victims also. Every few months, I spend 1 to 2 hours on the phone to have stuff removed from my credit files. And I have everything locked down, okay? I have everything locked down. But companies like AT&T and Uverse, for whatever reasons, unbeknownst to me, they just give out services, phones, whatever in my name. And then after the perp stops paying the bill, then they come after me looking for the money. I just tell them on the phone, just mark a charge off so I can get it removed from my credit.
So there's 4 credit bureaus out there in regards to individual identity theft. There's 4 credit bureaus out there. There's Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And And there's a fourth one called Innovis, Innovis. And the goal that every consumer should engage in, and I think you've already done this, Paul. I don't know if you did it for Innovis, is that you want to get a credit freeze at all 4 credit bureaus. And that credit freeze essentially is a lock on your credit. So in the event that you file for a line of credit for a new mobile phone or a new utility or a new loan, you won't be able to get that mobile phone or loan or line of credit unless you temporarily thaw your credit.
Yeah.
So a credit freeze gives you control on whether or not somebody can access your credit report. Yeah. And so that credit freeze is something that everybody should have in place, but most people don't. And I know when that happened to you, I'm pretty sure you jumped on and got credit freezes across the board. The fourth one being Innovis is something you definitely want to have too. And then once you have that level of control over when your credit can be checked or not, it prevents most forms of identity theft. So for me, I've had my credit frozen since 2008, which is when credit freezes were first available. Like the first week that they were available, I froze my credit across the board. And since that time, I've probably temporarily thawed my credit, I don't know, maybe in 14, 16 years, maybe 8, 10, 12 times, like once every couple of years. You know, leases. What's that?
It's a pain in the ass because you have to go through this process to undo it, and then you have to then go back in and reinitiate the process. So let's say I want to extend credit for some reason. I've got to go in, undo them. If I'm lucky, I can find out from the company which service they use and just unfreeze that one. But oftentimes they don't tell you, so you have to do them all. And then as soon as the inquiry hits, then you have to go right back in there and freeze everything. It takes time. It's a commitment in time.
So the process has got a little bit simpler. So what is, as long as you have, clean access to your credit freeze, to TransUnion, Experian, Equifax, Innovis, where you can log in and check everything out and log out and be good to go, that's no problem. Usually at the age of 18 years old, it's a little more complicated and convoluted. Those that are just getting into the game of credit, they have a harder time setting up credit freezes, my daughter being one of them. Otherwise, once you're an established adult with established credit, it's pretty easy to actually log in, username and passcode. There's a few qualifying questions they might ask, like, did you have a bank account with bank A, B, C, or D? Did you live at address A, B, C, or D? And once you get beyond that, you have a dashboard of the date and time, and it'll say, okay, what date do you want to temporarily thaw, and then what date do you want to have it automatically refreeze? So you shouldn't have to go back in to refreeze it. You should be able to temporarily thaw and refreeze on a specified date once you're in your dashboard. So it should be so. For example, me, I lease a vehicle like every 3 years, and I have a good relationship with my dealership. And I call up my, salesperson, Kevin, and I say, hey, Kevin, I'm interested in another, SLT. What do you have on the lot? Or what can I order? And he'll, let me know what the deal is. And I'll say, okay, great. He would remind me. He's like, oh, I remember you have that credit freeze. I'm like, yeah. And he'll say, okay, these days we're using Experian and TransUnion. So he'll send me the link to where I have to apply, and I'll temporarily thaw at TransUnion and Experian, and I'll go right there online and I'll apply for an application for the lease, and then I'll have it automatically refreeze within 24 to 48 hours. Simple enough.
Now here's an interesting scenario. Okay, CDK and other DMS providers, they use multiple third-party. Or not should say use, they integrate with multiple third-party software companies to do business. So essentially that sets up a read and write scenario or an open door to that DMS.
A larger attack surface is what we call that.
Larger attack surface.
More,
does that not expose those companies as well?
More points of entry. Yeah. So remember the Target breach? The Target breach was a pretty big one. And the Target breach, when that happened, it was one of the actual So when Target was breached, it was because Target has their vendor billing portal. Okay.
Yeah.
So Target's vendor billing portal is where, like, so for example, like an HVAC company would go into your local Target and service their rooftop AC HVAC units, right? You know how that works, right? Or service like all of their refrigerators and freezers if Target is selling groceries. Simple enough, right? So one of the small HVAC companies that was servicing a particular Target had malware, malicious software on their computer. So criminal hackers on the local HVAC company's computers are now on the computer at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, and they see that this HVAC company has access to Target's vendor billing system. And so as a result, username and passcode, they log into Target's vendor billing system. And they now, once they're inside beyond the firewall, once they punch in the username and passcode, they're inside the network. And once they were inside the network, they understood what they were looking at. They began to punch holes in that server, and they were able to go into other aspects of Target's network beyond the vendor billing system. And all this happened as a result of a third party, a Target vendor, right, that had access to their network. And that's a lot of times, that's how breaches like that occur. Whether or not that's the case with CDK, I don't know.
I think it was about 8 or 10 years ago, there was another DMS company, a smaller one, but nonetheless, it was a third-party vendor which allowed access to their data. I don't want to mention names, but that was back then, and that wasn't a ransomware situation. Robert Allen Carvel, now automotive customers are afraid their data has been breached. Just look at the date you give, the data you give the dealer when you buy a car. You give them all the data, so they have everything they need to successfully steal your identity.
Here's the deal with that, okay? And I appreciate that comment and that question or that statement. It makes sense to me. But here's the deal: like, my data is there. I expect that my data has been compromised. I expect that your data has been compromised. I expect that pretty much anybody who's bought a car in the past decade, their data is likely in some way compromised. I am not concerned about that. I'm not worried about that. It does not affect me in the least. And here's why. Okay. So here's what I tell my audiences is that our identities have already been compromised. Like there's been 150 billion records compromised in the past decade.
TransUnion, I think, was one of them, no?
Well,
one of the reporting agencies?
Equifax had 150 million records compromised. Equifax, 150 million. Okay.
Half the population in the U.S.
It was actually 2/3 of the American adult population, actually. Okay. One data breach. Okay. So my information was in that, probably yours. So here's how we look at all that. Like, people are like, oh, should I get dark web monitoring to find out if my information is on the dark web? I say, no. Why would you do that? Why? So that you can get an alert that says, oh, someone has your information. Oh, someone has your information. Now what? Do you put the covers over your head and cry yourself to sleep at night? What are you going to do? I tell everybody, consider your identity stolen. Now, I know that, like, that statement isn't comforting, but listen, consider your identity stolen. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the bad guy has got to you yet. You know, they've got billions of records to go through, 150 billion records. They may not have got to you specifically yet. Paul, they got to you. I've had criminal hackers email me my own social security number. Hey, security guy, here you go. Ha ha. Flexing their muscles. I'm like, whatever. The idea is to make the data that they already have useless to the thief. So since you and I were children, our parents have been giving out our social security number. Every job you've ever had, you've given out your social security number. Your social security number is sitting in a box in a warehouse somewhere that some jamoke has access to right now. Your social security number is on the dark web that's being traded and sold all the time. And there's nothing that you can do about that. But what you can do is make the data useless to the thief. That's why I don't care, because I do things to make the data that they already have useless to the thief. It's kind of like,
that's the
well,
law.
there's some paperwork involved, but like everything else, like there's work to do, right? So for me, like a credit freeze, like that's the first and foremost, you do that. Identity theft protection is a good option, which is like $15-20 a month. And depending on how many layers of protection you want to put in place, credit freeze, definitely. Identity theft protection, sure, do that, And then beyond that, it's likely that, like I ask my audiences all the time, I'll get in front of 500 people and I'll say, show of hands, how many of you can honestly say that you pretty much use a different passcode across all your critical accounts? I know what my answer is. It's yes. Okay. And it's you, right? Because you and I have had this conversation so many times. If you're not using a different passcode across each account, it's like I'm talking to myself, right? So the problem is when I ask that question in front of like 500 people, I'd be lucky if 50 of them raise their hand, which is like 10%, which
That's
means
crazy.
that 90% of the audience, they're using the same passcode across each account.
Yeah.
And that's because when it comes to security, most people, most consumers, even your CEOs, even your CIOs in some cases, they don't really pay much attention to it. And it's not that difficult. But, when you look at the fallout from poorly managed passwords, like this particular breach, I don't know the root of it. I don't know the nature of it, but I know that the Colonial Pipeline attack was as a result of a password. A password, It doesn't need to be that simple, but it often is. Today we talk about criminal hackers. Like they hacked my email. No, they didn't hack your email. They probably grabbed your username, which is an email address, and your password off the dark web from another data breach. And that other data breach contained the exact same credentials as your email account. So if you're using the same passcode for Facebook as you are for your Gmail, and if Facebook gets hacked, well, now your Gmail is vulnerable as well.
Now Greg has a question. He says, how does a business determine the security profile of a software company? So Greg, I think you're talking about a software company that does business with the larger company and or integrates with them, correct?
Yeah. So I think that every organization, so like with everything else in life, like you can do it yourself, or you can have like qualified individuals that's their expertise and they do it for you. Okay. So from the inside of not knowing what this gentleman's, I guess, expertise is, the answer lies with a qualified individual within the organization whose job it is to manage the data and the network security of that organization. Now, that might be his job, and he may be more or less qualified to lock down and keep that network secure and flesh out the security of your vendors. My suggestion is always, even if you are that individual in that organization whose job is to secure the network, that you should also consider an MSP, which is a managed service provider that also does security, and or a managed security service provider whose job is to make sure that your network is relatively, tight. And then at the same time, they're also looking at all other networks or vendors you're connected to. And they're also fleshing out the security of them to a degree, and how a vulnerability for a vendor or a third party that you're connected to in some way would affect you. And they look at every aspect of that. They look at that entire attack surface to determine where your vulnerabilities might be. So if the vulnerability is you've got a third party vendor who accesses your vendor billing system, and once they're inside your vendor billing system, they can punch holes in your network to access deeper into that network. Well, you've got many more problems than just that small HVAC company with free antivirus on their network. You know, the fact that your own network, once somebody accesses that vendor billing system, can punch holes in your own network, that's a problem in and of itself. See what I mean?
Legislation has come about recently where companies have to provide exact detail of what steps they've taken to secure their networks, what their plan is in the event of an incident, and who's responsible for doing what. All right. So, Greg, to answer your question, that third party has to supply that information to the larger company that they want to integrate with for them to even consider it.
Every state has their own rules and regs in regards to what companies that do business in their state, what their security protocols, what systems they need to have in place. Much of it starts at the federal level, Graham Leach, Bliley, and so forth, and then down to the state level. States like California, in New York, in Massachusetts, pretty much most of the other states, they look at the blueprint of New York and California and Massachusetts, and they follow that protocol from there. And then, so feds, state level, the attorneys general generally have their finger on the pulse of all that. And then all of your for-profit security companies, all your tech companies, they're looking at all of that. All your MSPs, all your MSSPs, they're looking at all of that. And a good, even if you were to hire a virtual CISO, you know, somebody who comes into your network and does a vulnerability scan and looks at your entire network and everybody you're connected to, they're going to be able to provide you with a pretty good synopsis of where your risks are and what you need to do to tighten them up.
Your favorite password manager.
So there are so many password managers out there. I say, like, do a quick Google search on password manager, and you'll see an article pop up in the first page of search via Wired magazine, PC magazine, and they've done some pretty good research on the top 10 password managers of 2024. People like 1Password, the number 1Password. They like even RoboForm is decent. Dashlane is okay. Bitwarden is okay. 1Password is kind of like the go-to these days. Even LastPass, who's had a couple of data breaches in the past few years, they've tightened things up quite a bit. Like, you have a data breach as a password manager, you're not going to let that happen again. So they're also a favorite as well. I would say do your research, try one out, see if you like it. Not all password managers behave the same way. They have like the nuances, and there's a learning curve. I say try one out. If you like it, then stick with it. Eventually pay for it. And I think for me, a password manager is by far the best use of my time and my money for my information security.
And then also firewalls and VPNs, right?
Yeah,
that's more secure.
On its absolute basics level, when I say basics, like your Windows operating system, your Mac operating system, if we're talking like just my device and your device, on a consumer level, right? Like, even Windows now comes with a decent firewall. All of your antivirus companies, McAfee, Trend Micro, Avast, Symantec, they all have antivirus, anti-spyware, anti-phishing, and a firewall built into their paid services. And in general, for your consumer devices, to protect your online banking, to protect, your Amazon account, your eBay account, or just your general, email and so forth, that is generally sufficient for general computing. Once you get on the server level at a dealership, you're looking at additional layers of protection, additional hardware and software, literally hardware that functions as a firewall, Barracuda and so forth, that would serve much better.
Another thing that people can do also to minimize their exposure It's multi-factor authentication.
So that's like 101 as far as I'm concerned. And yes, agreed. So for
But
example,
not everybody does it.
exactly. So usually when I poll an audience, how many of you are using multi-factor authentication for email? If I get 20% of the room to raise their hand, it's astonishing to me. Which means 8 out of 10 people are not using multi-factor authentication for email, which is tragic. And the problem with that is, like I said earlier, the goal is, even if they do have your information on the dark web, the goal is to make the data useless to the thief. And the way you do that is by, in the case of identity theft protection, they're monitoring your credit. Credit freeze locks down your credit report. Password manager. You change up all your passcodes. You never have the same passcode twice. Even if the bad guy has your passcode, if you have two-factor authentication, they're going to need your mobile phone to log in.
I need the 6-digit code that I'm texting you now before we give you access to the next window.
Exactly. So two-factor authentication deployed on any and all critical accounts is absolutely essential. Like, I don't care if they have my password. They need my mobile phone in their possession to be able to log in. And I'm not stupid enough to get engaged in a man-in-the-middle attack where they call me and say, hey, it's Microsoft. We just text you a one-time passcode. Please provide it to us. I'm not going to engage in that, but plenty of people might. So be aware of that stuff, So making the data useful to the thief is by deploying a number of different layers of protection. And if you need to know, okay, so how do I enable two-factor authentication? So Paul, let me ask you a question. If you needed to know how to enable two-factor authentication for a particular website, how would you do it?
It says first of all, a lot of the websites today, they recommend it and they tell you, if you haven't set it up, would you like to set up multi-factor authentication now? Yeah. So they make it really easy for you to do.
Yeah.
And you can even Google it too.
Perfect.
Or
so if you search, exactly. If you Google Gmail two-factor, just Gmail two-factor, on the first page of search, you're going to see myaccount.google.com set up two-factor authentication. Or you search, Yahoo two-factor authentication. Bang, help.yahoo.com, how to set up two-factor authentication. Or eBay two-factor authentication. eBay.whatever community.com, how to set up two-factor authentication. Like, it's right there. Just Google it. And you will be more secure than 80% of the population, becoming a tougher target just by setting up two-factor authentication, a password manager, getting a credit freeze, investing in paid antivirus, anti-spyware, anti-phishing, and a firewall, and setting up a credit, identity theft protection. Those basic things, you become a tougher target.
When I worked for CDK and other big companies, they have regular training modules you have to take, things to watch out for. Also, they did system-generated phishing attacks.
Yeah.
So that the employees would get emails, and I've gotten some of these, and I would report them as a phishing, and get the email back, congratulations, you've just passed today's phishing test. So companies out there, I can tell you this, working for car dealerships for decades, not once, I repeat, have I ever gotten any kind of training regarding safeguarding of the company information and or any type of internal phishing attack, which is the most basic. I think the stat is either 52 or 54% of ransomware attacks are the result of a phishing attack.
Human error.
That people are human error. I don't care how much you spend on whatever you spend it on. If a person clicks on the wrong thing, it's game over.
Human hacking. So, Paul, what you're referring to is phishing simulation training. And phishing simulation training is delivered to less than 60% of all corporations at this point. Everybody has access to it, but less than 60% actually consume it. Like most of your government agencies consume it. Most of your large tech corporations, most of your Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 consume it, But yeah, most of your small mom and pops, most of your small, medium-sized businesses don't. They don't necessarily think they would become a target for that matter. Okay?
There you go.
I provide security awareness training. And what that means is, in addition to phishing simulation training, in addition to explaining, okay, when it comes to cybersecurity, do this, don't do that, do this, and don't do that. Yes, I provide that level of, okay, these are all the things you have to be aware of. These are the risks. This is how you proceed. These are the strategies. This is the actionable, do's and don'ts. But beyond that, the biggest problem that most of us have when it comes to security awareness training is that even though we may pass that phishing simulation test, even though we may understand the basics revolving around do this and don't do that, most of us, when it comes to security, we don't really want to deal with it. We don't want to engage in it. We don't even want to believe that it would happen to us. We don't even want to think that an identity thief or a criminal hacker would target me or my bank account or my identity or my family. And what happens is we end up functioning in a state of denial, saying it can't happen to me. So when I get in front of an audience, one of the questions I ask them is, like, how many of you lock the doors to your house? And I might get 80%. And then I get, well, how many of you actually have a home security system? And I get like 20%. And I'm like, oh, so why is that? Why do you not have a home security system? And as far as I'm concerned, all security is personal. Whether it's on the network level, your identity, all security is personal security. And so I asked them, like, why don't you have that home security system? And they say, and I get the answers like, well, I don't want to live like that. I'm like, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, I don't want to live in
the world we live in.
They say, well, I don't want to live like that. Well, I said, well, what does that actually mean? Well, I don't want to live in fear. And I'm like, so you think that by investing in security, you think by putting systems in place to reduce risk, that the actions that you're taking means that you're acknowledging that there is risk out there. Therefore, you will become fearful of that risk. Is that what that means? Well, if you say it like that, but yeah, but no, yeah, well. And then, so what I do is I question their belief systems as far as what security is and what security isn't. Like, I'll ask you this question, and I know the clock is ticking here, but like, I'm a guy that has 20 plus security cameras. I do. Between the inside and outside of my house. Now, you hear like, this guy's got 20 plus security cameras. Like, what does that, what is the general consensus of a guy that engages in that level of security? He must be what? What?
Just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not watching.
Exactly. So when we equate somebody who engages in the process of reducing risk as paranoid, right?
Yeah.
Which is what you just did, in all fairness, right? Why? And if you know anything about what paranoia actually is, if you've ever brushed up against anybody who actually is diagnosed a paranoid, you'd know that that person's life is very difficult to live. Paranoia is an awful, awful, awful disease. It is a disease of the mind. Paranoia is awful. And I have close family who are diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. And it's an awful existence for that person and her family and her extended family and her local police for that matter. Okay. And so if we as a culture, if we as a society, if we equate paranoia, which is a mental health issue, and security in the same sentence, why would anybody ever want to engage in the process of security? Why would you ever want security? And so we as a culture, we as a society, we repel security. We say it can't happen to me. I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to be paranoid. I don't want to live in fear. And we do nothing. And I see this every day of my life. And companies like CDK, like whether or not the chief information security officer actually engages in home security, protects his identity, has a credit freeze, locks his door, takes self-defense, if that person truly believes in security, then something like that shouldn't happen. You know what I mean? Like, security really begins with you as an individual, your person first. And then once you believe and drink the security Kool-Aid, then every other aspect of your life becomes that much more secure. But it's not about being paranoid. It's not about worry. It's not about fear. It's about recognizing risk and doing something about it. You don't put your seatbelt on because you're paranoid. You put your seatbelt on because it's smart. You're reducing risk. It gives you control. That's what that's there for. But when people look at security as it's paranoia, it's worry, it's fear, they're not going to do it. They're just going to function in denial and do nothing. And I see it every single day of the week.
What I want to leave the dealers with is, if you don't have any kind of internal product or program where you are doing internal attacks to simulate external attacks to make sure your people know what to do, you're putting yourself, your company, and all of your customers at risk, because it only takes one person to click the wrong link to let the bad guys into your network, which is essentially an ATM machine for data as far as criminals are concerned. Yeah. So it's a lot of stuff we covered here tonight. A lot of people watch the show on the replay. I hope they watch every minute of it and take some of the steps needed. Robert's contact info is in the post on LinkedIn, so you could reach out to him. This is what he does. Okay, this is not a YouTube video where you're fixing your own washing machine. You have millions of dollars of exposure because you have tens of thousands of records, and all of those records are valuable. So, Robert, I want to thank you for coming on, sharing security tips with us.
Thank you, buddy.
I'm sure this story will develop more, and we'll probably do a follow-up to it as we get deeper in it. But don't think this problem is going away, because it's not. It's only going to get worse going forward. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Google me. See me on online at robertsiciliano.com, ROBERTSICILIANO, robertsiciliano.com. I'm on the dark web. I'm on the interwebs. I'm everywhere. You can find me anywhere.
Excellent. Thank you very much. To those that watch the show weekly, thanks for your support. To those that watch it on the replay, I appreciate you as well. Have a safe and successful next week, and we'll see you next week on Sunday Night Live.